Hello and welcome to the Week in 60 Minutes, brought to you on Thursday, the 8th of December. I'm James Heale, the Spectator's diary editor. Coming up on the show. Can Rishi Sunak keep his party together? The government has had to make several U-turns over the last week. I'll be joined by James Forsyth and Katy to discuss. One person who will be leaving politics is Matt Hancock. The former Health Secretary has announced that he'll be stepping down in the same week as his version of what happened during the pandemic has been published. I'll be speaking to journalist and lockdown skeptic Isabel Oakeshott about what it was like to co-author Pandemic Diaries with Matt Hancock. Meanwhile, in Iran, hundreds of people have been killed by the government as the protests rage on. What will be the lasting impact of these protests? I speak to Paul Wood. Also today, the Battle of the Windsors enters a new phase with the release of Harry and Meghan's Netflix documentary. Are they intent on taking William and Kate down? I speak to Freddy and author Gyles Brandreth. And finally, is your office Christmas party coming back with a fury? I speak to Spectator World's Cara Kennedy about the joys of breaking down office hierarchies with the help of the festive spirit and, of course, a lot of alcohol. Before we get going, if you enjoy Spectator TV, then do subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss another episode. You can also subscribe to The Spectator this Christmas and get the next 12 weeks of print and online access, as well as a bottle of Paul Roger champagne, all for just £12. This offer is available to the UK only. Go to www.spectator.co.uk/Santa to subscribe. First up, is Rishi Sunak having party management issues? Over the last week, the Prime Minister's U-turned on subjects from onshore wind to planning reform. And meanwhile, Labour's on the offensive, as Shadow Chancellor Rachel Reeves tells Katy in this week's issue. Katy joins me now, together with our political editor, James Forsyth. James and Katy, welcome to Spectator TV. Let's talk first about party management problems. And James, you mentioned your column this week. You talk about the planning and the onshore wind rebellions, but these haven't been as damaging for Rishi Sunak as perhaps some recent rebellions for his two predecessors. Why is that?
I think because these rebellions have been quite contained to the specific issue. Planning has always been difficult. Even when Boris Johnson had that big majority, he faced rebellions on planning over the housing algorithm and then over the reforms more generally after the Chesham and Amersham by-election. I also think the housing rebellion was clearly not a threat to his leadership in that the person leading it, Theresa Villiers, had backed him very enthusiastically in both contests. I think the onshore wind one was an interesting development because it was obviously Simon Clarke putting down an amendment to his successor's bill. It was then signed by two previous Prime Ministers, Liz Truss and Boris Johnson. But they have now got to a compromise. And I mean, interestingly, the compromise essentially allows these onshore wind farms where communities want them. And interestingly, you haven't seen a kind of equal and opposite reaction from the kind of anti-wind farm people on the other side of the party. So they appear to have navigated their way through that. I think the challenge is that, all legislation has to be able to get through Parliament, otherwise it's not going to work. But I think, Labour have used a lot of trying to attack these amendments, saying, look, you're having to negotiate with your own party, all of this. I think in a way, the question is, can you preempt these in future so you don't end up having to have the negotiations in such a public way?
Seeing what's coming down the track effectively, and alongside those that need for the Tories to take care, there's also, should be noted, Labour have really stepped up their game in Parliament. We saw that this week with Michelle Mone and the amendment put down in the House of Lords to try and get some of those documents revealed over PPE contracts. Katy, you were speaking to Labour's Rachel Reeves, who seems to have a bit of a spring in her step. What was your interview like, and what was your sense of how Labour are doing at this stage of the Parliament?
Yeah, I think it's hard for Labour not to have a spring in their step at the moment. If you look at the polling, they're consistently polling at least 20 points ahead. I think Rishi Sunak has, narrowed the gap by about 5 points, from Liz Truss, but we're still talking about a huge Labour majority. This was to be projected in a general election. You have this week, I think Rachel Reeves is particularly happy because while Rishi Sunak, since taking over, I think that it's quite competitive now, again, on the question of who you trust more in the economy, and the Tories, Rishi Sunak leads in some polls. You have a conference this week with business coming out for Labour, and the mission she's set herself in terms of restoring trust in Labour on the economy and fiscal responsibility. I think she thinks that lots of things have happened. It was interesting in the interview. She said one of the moments where she thought things, actually, she is managed to, see some consequences of her work was at Labour conference when often leaders give a speech and the bits where you expect people to cheer. So with Labour it would be, RNHS. And she had a line saying, and that is why Labour is the party of fiscal responsibility. And I got a standing ovation. And she was not expecting that. So there've been a few signs there. But in the interview, she is talking, I think she distanced herself very much from Corbynomics, which I don't think is hugely surprising. You remember Rachel Reeves is someone who refused to serve under Jeremy Corbyn, not that he would have asked her potentially. She was seen so much being on the right of the Labour Party that when Keir Starmer first formed his shadow cabinet, there were some people saying she would get shadow chancellor, but it was seen as too divisive actually in terms of the PLP. So he first had Annalise Dodds, and then after some time he moved in Rachel Reeves. But she's saying everything will be fully costed in the manifesto, and effectively saying that will mean that some things that Labour would like to do, something similar Keir Starmer said in his interview, will not happen straight away, and some of those pledges will not take place. And then I thought was quite interesting was I said, well, Jeremy Hunt, when he took over in number 11, he called lots of his predecessors, took advice, including Kwasi Kwarteng, despite the circumstances of Jeremy Hunt coming in, which was obviously Liz Truss asking Kwasi Kwarteng to go. And he asked them for advice. So he said, did you do that with former shadow chancellors? What about John McDonnell? He said, not the first call. Instead, she was much more positive about George Osborne, saying that she thought if in power, Keir Starmer and herself should like to take some of the relationship that David Cameron and George Osborne had.
And of course, George Osborne was a shadow chancellor who ended up being very successful in that 2010 campaign and then thereafter in government. It seems from both your pieces this week, it's this question of competence and trust. And there seems to be sort of tacit, unspoken agreement between the parties about who's more trusted with the economy. Perhaps, James, is that sort of the issue, particularly with the winter of discontent almost 2.0 beckoning with strikes?
I think it's a precondition of any Tory revival in the polls that they show that they have a grip. And I mean, these strikes there is an obvious challenge for the government in to keep the country functioning during these strikes. And then there's a political question about where does the blame lie? Do people who can't catch a train next week, do they say, oh my word, this is just another sign that nothing works in Britain and blame the Tories for that? Or do they think, why couldn't they? Why couldn't the rail unions have taken the offer? Why couldn't they have accepted the government's request for a kind of Christmas truce so the hospitality industry doesn't get clobbered by these strikes? And I mean, that question of blame is interesting. I mean, it's also very striking that at the moment Labour are running, as all oppositions would when they are, as Katy said, as far ahead the polls out. They're running a small target strategy. So they are trying to suggest the government is to blame for the strike. They call the militant government, they call it, suggest the government wants to scapegoat nurses for what's wrong with the NHS. But I haven't heard anyone on the Labour side suggest what kind of pay rise they would be prepared to offer nurses. Yeah. Rachel Reeves said at this conference that Katy was just talking about earlier, that, she wasn't going to pluck a number out of the air. This is very deliberate ambiguity from Labour. And I think there is a real question here, which is, because of these poll leads, as you get closer to election day, people will start saying to Labour, so how do your sums add up? And that, I think, is going to be the challenge for Labour, because I think at the moment, all the things they are doing and saying suggest that they intend to go into that campaign basically saying they're going to stick to not to every dot and comma of it, but basically stick to the Tory spending plans.
Well, of course, it's a 1997 strategy, isn't it, Katy? And I was struck in your interview with Rachel, where she sort of brought up the 1997 comparison between the assisted places scheme abolition and this now proposal to remove the charity status on private schools. To what extent is Labour kind of reviving the 1997 playbook in the hopes it'll take them from opposition to government as did? That was the last time.
I think you can see a lot of that, and they're obviously hoping it's going to be a 97 moment in terms of the results too. I think there's still some caution. For example, Keir Starmer's in all these interviews say we're not complacent. He's also, barred all his advisors from posting the poll leads and the WhatsApp groups he's in, I'm told. But you can also see Labour, slightly to James's point, not wanting to be too bold and actually not wanting to give too much away yet. So there's obviously a really key question, which is, yes, Rachel Reeves is saying a Labour government won't pledge, huge spending. Once at least that's the implication, and because she accepts the OBR, she accepts the fiscal framework. But then, I put to her, well, do you think that taxes are too high? So she said taxes on working people are too high. So I said, well, in which case, if let's see, do we really think Labour are going to go ahead with these cuts that the Tories have planned for an election? So if it's going to be higher taxes, is it fair to say Labour would focus more on business taxes than personal taxes? Now, she wouldn't get drawn too much on that, but she did go and say we would make fairer decisions on tax. And she also wouldn't talk about closing loopholes. And therefore, we're not yet at the point where I think Labour would spell it out, but it seems to me that they would be moving more towards business taxes, if you read between the lines of what they're saying. But as soon as you get into the detail, you get into tricky decisions. And again, we didn't put it in the interview, but on strikes, it was a very similar situation to what she said today, but where she won't get into the specifics. And that means it's much harder. But if this party is about to win a really big majority, I think they'll get in a situation nearer the election where they really do have to spell some of these things out.
James, what kind of timeline is it here in the lead up to the next election? I mean, what point do Labour have to, this line about refusing to give details on kind of tax and spend plans, on how much they would pay in terms of wages and public sector rising, how long can that line hold?
I think Labour will try and hold off for quite some time. And I think they will also argue that, look, every fiscal event is accompanied by a new OBR forecast, so these numbers move around, so you can't expect us to go for specifics now, they'll say. I think the most revealing thing about Labour is, if you look back to Liz Truss's mini-budget, is yes, Labour opposed, for example, the abolition of the 45p rate, but they immediately spent that money on something else. They basically accepted the envelope that Liz Truss was going for, even if they were making very different choices. And I think that, to my mind, suggests that Labour are not going to go down a kind of 1992 route of a kind of shadow budget, a whole new set of numbers. I think they are basically going to have some symbolically different choices to the Tories on, private school fees, VAT, and things like that, but there's not going to be that much substantial difference. And I think it is essentially like a kind of boxer's clinch. I mean, they don't want to give the Tories room to swing a punch. I mean, that is what Labour are planning to do.
I've got to ask my final question. I think it's probably my favourite line in this week's entire magazine, which is in Katy's interview with Rachel. Rachel Reeves sends out 3,200 Christmas cards each year. She starts signing them in the summer. Is that a record in Westminster? Do you know anyone else who can beat that?
So I've asked around since. So ahead of this interview, it was in Portcullis House in Parliament, and we're just asking a few people we saw, what's the most interesting thing you've heard about Rachel Reeves before your interview? And someone said, I heard she starts her Christmas card list really early. So, okay, let's give that a go. And then, so we heard you started in the summer. So 2 right. And then she started going into 3,200. All I have to point out, ink signatures.
Wow.
So some leaders try and get around this by doing a printed signature. And I have to say, I put to a very senior politician, I won't give away the game just yet, who will be in the Christmas issue of the magazine. How many cards do you do? And they were not near Rachel Reeves' number. And they were also quite impressed that she is obviously putting the ink signature in, which means effectively, I think she's almost running a boot camp where any time you have, a bit of spare time, signing a few Christmas cards to get through the number. So I as far as I know, the MPs are welcome to get in touch and correct us. She is quite far ahead if you take into account these are personally signed.
Well, MPs, please do get in touch and correct us if we're wrong. And James and Katy, thank you for joining us. Now then, one person who's already decided about politics is Matt Hancock. He said he'll step down in the next election the same week as publishing his Pandemic Diaries, which put forward his side of the narrative on exactly what happened when he was Health Secretary. So what was it like for a passionate lockdown skeptic to co-author his book? Isabel Oakeshott joins me now. Isabel, welcome to Spectator TV.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in to discuss your new book.
Thank you.
Co-written with Matt Hancock on the Pandemic Diaries. First question, really, what was it like to work with Matt?
Well, that is not an easy question to answer. I worked out this is my 10th book.
Wow.
And each one is uniquely traumatic. Every time I think the next one can't be as bad. I mean, this one, the challenge was that it was so much longer than I anticipated. I mean, a standard political book, as you know, is about 80,000 words. Now, Matt's story was so extraordinary and the detail was so riveting that actually I had to indulge him and let him run it a bit longer. But when I say a bit longer, the book did end up being twice the length that I wanted and anticipated originally, and probably half the length that he would have liked.
And you write in this week's magazine about how he was to deal with, and one of the things you had to obviously contend with was the government's own response to this, which is the redactions from the Cabinet Office. And you said it's almost about 300 edits or tweaks or changes. What was Matt like dealing with those and dealing with the Cabinet Office?
So I always say to people that I work with when I write books for and with people that they shouldn't edit themselves during the process. While we're discussing what we could put in the book, they should tell me everything. And then at the end, we'll go through a process of deciding what we can and can't get away with. In this case, we did that, but then there was another process, which was submitting the manuscript to the Cabinet Office, because he had to do that under ministerial rules that apply to people who were in senior positions. And back they came with almost 300 things that they objected to. And in some cases, they were quite minor things. And, I wasn't going to die in a ditch over them. Neither was Matt. There was a number of the points they made. You felt, well, actually, that's quite reasonable. We can accept that. We've got to give them some wins. There were a number of others that, and you're going to ask me what they were, and I'm not going to tell you on this occasion, that literally made my blood boil.
Really?
Certain things that they wanted us to change that I thought were entirely unreasonable. And then there was another category that they wanted taken out, which were just really the objection was betraying certain kind of mischievous confidences. And to Matt Hancock's credit, he actually pushed back quite hard. Some of that was under pressure from me, but one of the good things about working with him was that he did completely get it in terms of what do we need for this book to be really readable and pacey? Because the subject matter itself couldn't be more serious. We're talking about the most seismic political, economic, health event of our times. As we all know, tragically, a lot of people died. So, fundamentally, this is not a light-hearted story. And yet, I didn't really want to write a book which was about the race for the vaccine, which is what he initially envisaged. And I think Kate Bingham, who is a vaccine czar, has done that very well. I thought that it should be much broader than that. And I thought that diary form was the most accessible to the most number of readers. And of course, we're always conscious of, is this a secret diary of Adrian Mole, aged 44 and a quarter? Look, I knew that we would get that criticism, so did he. But then again, it was our best hope and remains the best way, I think, of bringing his story to an audience that's beyond the Westminster bubble.
Quite, and you mentioned the breadth there. There's a whole number of topics in the book and in the articles you write about this week. What was the most surprising thing you learned about sort of vaccines or care homes? What really stood out to you?
Oh, I mean, look, the absolute joy of this project as a journalist, which is what I am first and foremost and through, was it's just story after story after story. And, if you're a political journalist, as I am and you are, and you're immersed in this stuff, what you long for is that fly-on-the-wall detail that's really difficult to get. You only get it if someone has decided just to splurge it all. And that's what he did. So for me, the biggest thrill was really in the detail. It wasn't in the headline revelations, of which, by the way, there are plenty, whether it's the fact that they've genuinely thought about releasing all prisoners, except perhaps the most tremendously violent ones, whether it's the fact that the vaccine policy kind of morphed from let's just vaccinate the vulnerable and then it's cry freedom, as he told this very fine magazine, into let's attempt to vaccinate the whole population. And what struck me about that, as I've said in the piece for the magazine, is how little discussion there was about the cost benefit of that policy. It's like, for me, that is the greatest political goalpost moving of all times. That whole, okay, we're going to vaccinate a few. Oh, no, actually, we're going to vaccinate the whole population. Extraordinary, multi-billion-pound economic implications of that policy. And for me, much more importantly, the health and social consequences.
And one of the really interesting things, of course, is that you were quite a lockdown skeptic.
Absolutely.
Who called a lot of this stuff out at the time. And subsequently, Matt Hancock, obviously, was much more on the pro-lockdown side. And I think the sense from the book is very much that, he felt he was right about a lot of this kind of stuff. You must have had a lot of discussions with him and he must have gone over the detail like you have as well. Do you get any sense of either any admissions that either of you were wrong at all? And who was right, basically, between you two?
Obviously, it was me.
Obviously, as well.
Look, I'm unconverted. He knew from the start that I was a lockdown skeptic. I was pretty vocal at the time. And in some ways, that is why I took on this project. You know, my fellow lockdown skeptics, and many of us had a really hard time, you know, sticking our neck out at a time when it was certainly not fashionable to question lockdowns. And indeed, one tended to be accused of wanting people to die or being willing to kill people and all these crazy accusations. So for those of us that have been on what for many has been a painful journey in terms of trying to express a dissenting view, some have looked at what I've done in collaborating with Matt Hancock and raised more than one eyebrow. You know, they have thought, what is Isabel Oakeshott doing working with this figure that they see as the architect of everything that they abhor? The answer to that is that journalists don't just interrogate people they agree with. Journalists shouldn't just work with people they agree with. On the contrary, you know, without flattering myself, who better to go and interrogate Matt Hancock and try to extract the maximum detail as to what he was really up to and what everyone else was really up to than somebody who didn't agree with the policy. You know, if he had worked with somebody who was lapping it all up, who thought that the pandemic response was pretty much as good as it could possibly have been, they wouldn't have asked the awkward questions. They wouldn't have pushed to see yet another message, yet another document, so that we could get as much in there as possible. And the fact is that Matt still doesn't think that he got it wrong. And I respect his right to not think he got it wrong. You know, he had all the information. I believe that he did the best he could in his mind with the information that was available. But because he doesn't think he got any of it wrong, he was actually quite surprisingly open to disclosure. You know, he tended to be more in favour of revealing than the opposite. Now, of course, I can't know what I don't know. So I don't know what has been, if anything has been not told to me, where the cover-ups may have come. What I would say simply is that I was pleasantly surprised by how much I got.
That's very interesting. And do you think that was more a sense of right in retrospect or just right at the time? Was there any kind of contrition or perhaps any kind of sense of we got this one bit element wrong but our intentions were right at the time at all?
Not quite enough, as far as I'm concerned. Look, there are certain accusations that genuinely seem to wound him because he feels they are so unjust. So the two things he's most defensive on are care homes and PPE contracts and contracts for cronies. And if I take them very briefly in turn, care homes, I actually find in his favour on that one broadly. He's often... widespread accusation is that he kind of blithely ordered the discharge of elderly people from hospitals into care homes without testing them properly, thereby seeding COVID in care homes with devastating consequences. In reality, the testing capacity wasn't there. He clearly instructed care home operators to isolate those patients. I've seen the documentation. And it was subsequently apparent by independent audits and so on that actually the prime driver of infection spread in care homes was the movement of staff. Now, politically, from one home to another, that was really quite tricky because the minute you start talking about it actually being caused by staff, you get into a territory where everybody, you know, howls with indignation and says, "You're blaming the staff," and that is exactly what's happened now. We've put that in the book, and sure enough, care home industry is up in arms, but that was a reality.
And what was the PPE as well?
The second one is PPE. He gets really riled about this. He clearly, genuinely doesn't think that he has bears any responsibility for the awarding of contracts to cronies. And he was personally accused of potentially profiting from a contract that was awarded to his sister. I don't know what her company is, but actually when you looked at the detail, he had nothing to do with it. I think she was a subcontractor or something, and it was in Wales, and it really was nothing to do with him. When it comes to Michelle Mone, I have seen some of the correspondence on that, and I have seen him saying, I'm not using the precise words here, I'm paraphrasing, I do not want to deal with this woman. It's got trouble written all over it. This is me paraphrasing. So he really dodged a bullet on that one. Are there other things that he did in relation to PPE or other COVID-related contracts that I don't know about that might come out. I can't rule that out, but I really have observed how upset this makes him. And genuinely, when people are that riled about something, it's because they think it's an unjust accusation.
It's very interesting. One line in your piece in the magazine was about social media and the way in which I think that's very much a debate that's still going on at the moment with the online safety bill going through Parliament. And you say, for instance, that one of Matt Hancock's team has sort of reached out to Twitter to get them to change their algorithms as early as January.
Yes.
What was the sort of story around there? And do you think there's more to come out in terms of, obviously there's a debate in America right now with what's going on with Twitter. Do you think there's a sort of debate coming on in the UK about how and where the social media giants were sort of pressured perhaps by UK government officials?
I think all of this is really important because I'm of the view this should never happen again. Never again should an entire population be subjected to repeated, prolonged lockdowns for a condition that didn't actually pose a very, very high mortality risk to the majority of the population. Of course, it was very dangerous to some people. So I think it's vital that the public public inquiry into the response is not a whitewash. And I think everything needs to be on the table on that. You know, the suppression of dissenting voices was really serious. And Matt Hancock would defend this to his dying day. And I will argue the opposite, that it was utterly wrong to crush opposing views in the way that they did. I'm not saying it was utterly wrong to make sure that people didn't readily land when they were Google searching the vaccine. They didn't immediately land on some crazy anti-vax stuff that was genuinely likely to undermine the public health response or, you know, frighten people quite unnecessarily. But it was quite wrong that real bits of information backed up by real experts and clinical studies, or whether it's the yellow card warning system for adverse reactions or claimed adverse reactions, was routinely and systematically dismissed as medical misinformation, and people found that they had their Twitter accounts suspended and other social media. I felt very restricted on what I could and couldn't question. I mean, this is extraordinary. And there are so many repercussions now coming through. I think people in this country are only fully beginning to realise, and we're only on the cusp of that, the devastating long-term consequences for the economy, for health, and most importantly for our children of what we did. But I do say at the end of the piece in the magazine that I think that the mistakes on the part of our politicians were made in good faith.
Well, a good note to end on, but I want to ask you one final question is, Matt Hancock announced earlier today he's going to be standing out for the House of Commons. You've worked with him closely. You've seen him go off to the jungle for the I'm a Celebrity. You've seen all the revelations come out in the Daily Mail, part of the serialisation. Just wondered what's next for Matt Hancock?
Well, who knows? I think it was probably a wise decision on his part. I think so many of his generation of Tory MPs are making that decision. You know, Matt's still really young. You know, he's in his early 40s. I think he could have a fantastic career in the creative industries. After all, he has been culture secretary as well. Obviously now has plenty of first-hand experience of the TV industry. But equally, he might go into the cryptocurrency world. That's one of his great interests, or finance. So look, this is a guy, whether you like him or you don't like him, multi-talented, as we discovered on I'm a Celebrity, a full range of talents, some of which may or may not have much application in the real world. But I don't think he's going to be short of options.
Isabel, thank you very much for joining us, and thank you for watching Spectator TV. In Iran, the protests are simply not dying down, even in the face of brutal state suppression. Is that because the country has moved away from Islamic fundamentalism irrevocably? Paul Wood writes on this issue in this week's magazine, and he joins me now. Paul, welcome to Spectator TV. Tell us about what's going on in Iran. The protests have fallen out of the headlines a little bit. What's been happening there?
Well, the protests have fallen out of the headlines, as you say, but if you talk to Iranian opposition groups, as I do, there's a constant stream of videos from across the country showing that people are still out on the streets. And this is what is important and different about these protests. They are now in their 11th week, heading towards 3 months. More than 450 people killed, 14,000 arrested. These obviously are opposition figures. So we've had more people killed in the past, But I don't think we've ever seen the longevity of protests like these. We haven't seen them up and down the country at all corners of Iran, all ethnic and religious groups, or most of them, in the regime's heartland as well as on the fringes. And talking to people who really know Iran and really follow Iran, they think this could be an existential crisis for the regime. This is the biggest challenge, in the opinion of most Iran watchers, that the theocratic regime has faced since its inception.
And given all those challenges and the regional spread, the fact that there's so much longevity, what's the state really doing in response to all of this?
Well, they are moving very cautiously. They have a playbook which they've used in the past, which is to carefully calibrate the violence until at some point, as in 2019, they decide now is the moment to crack down. And they killed 1,500 people, according to human rights groups, in 3 days back in 2019. So that is what the activists are afraid of, whether that moment is coming, because the regime still has the guns, they still have all the tools of repression. But another reason why this protest is different is because it is led by women and girls. And really the regime does not know how to react to this. What they fear doing is sending a lot of police and paramilitary forces out onto the streets and attacking these young women with batons and tear gas and live rounds and causing a backlash. You can sense the unease in some of the vacillating statements that there have been from people in authority in Iran. They don't know how to handle this protest led by women.
As you say, a very different response if it was done by men. Well, there's a lot of reports over the weekend that Iran has abolished the morality police. Talk us through what exactly has happened there, because there's been some conflicting reports about that.
Well, the situation's confused. The Attorney General appeared in remarks that were interpreted in the West anyway, to say that the morality police would be shut down. This was not backed up by any other member of the Iranian government. And local media began saying, well, what he was talking about was the position in law, the formal position that the Ministry of Justice and the Attorney General, and the man who was speaking, didn't have direct control over them. So if this was the government shutting them down or even putting up a trial balloon, that's a sign of the vacillation and almost panic that I was talking about in my last answer. This is the regime, really confronted with a problem it doesn't know how to deal with. I don't think we can say the morality police have been abolished. This was either a misinterpretation or a trial balloon. This has not been backed up by other elements of the government. But the important point is talking to activists. They don't care. I mean, this started with a young woman being arrested for what was called bad hijab, not concealing her hair properly, and then dying in a police station. But it's gone beyond that. And they say that the activists say they're not going to stop. They want to go all the way with this and get regime change.
Yes, and you speak to a woman called Katy in your piece. She sounds incredible. What's her story? Explain that to our audience.
Well, she's a member of a small opposition group called the POMI, the Mujahideen al-Haq, the People's Mujahideen of Iran, which a long time ago, decades ago, had a brief spell when it was part of an armed resistance. Hasn't been that for a long time. Probably doesn't carry that much weight inside Iran, but is very good at organising and publicising the message, and a lot of journalists like me speak to them. She's 35 years old, an accountant. I don't think we should assume this is her real name. It's still very dangerous to speak to outsiders, and the regime is so worried about people speaking to outsiders that it's been slowing down the internet such that it took me a couple of weeks to get these answers out of her. Messages passed backwards and forwards rather than a live conversation. But she's been part of previous uprisings. And in her view, in her words, this one is different because people have shaken off the fear they've had of the regime in the past. Now, bear in mind, she's a member of an activist group. This is the kind of thing you expect the activists to say. And it's the kind of thing that journalists like me have heard in every previous demonstration. But there is a feeling, as I say, among seasoned Iran watchers that this time it may be different. It's been going on for longer. It's the element of women and girls and the feeling that the regime doesn't know how to handle this.
And what can we in the West do? You talk about in your piece about sanctioning Iranian oil. Is there anything the West can do, or is this purely a national self-contained movement?
Well, I assume nobody's calling for us to invade Iran, but there are degrees of help, and the most practical thing, as the piece says, would be to sanction the regime's sale of oil, which would cut off the money supply. Joel Rayburn, who was in charge of Iran on the US National Security Council a few years ago under Donald Trump, was telling me that the Trump administration got the number of barrels of oil per day being sold down to some 400,000. It's now about 1 million. So that would cut off the regime's money supply. Of course, in the short term, if the regime thinks its survival is at stake and they give the order to crack down, short of invading or arming these groups on the street, there is little that can be done. And so I guess you have to ask also, what's our vital national interest here? Well, it would certainly be in the interest of Western countries to have a secular democracy in Iran, but it is not in the interest of Western countries to have a civil war in Iran. So certainly Joel Rayburn's opinion was that any help which were to be given should be given on the basis that the opposition remains united. That, again, is one of the new aspects of these protests. People do seem to be acting with unity across, for instance, the Kurdish, Persian, Baluchi divide. And it's another reason why these protests are different. But if the money supply is cut off, that's certainly what the activists want. And they want, for instance, the IRCG, the elite military forces of Iran, to be listed as a terrorist group in Europe, as they are now in the United States. So a lot of this is symbolic. Some of it, cutting the money off, is real. But ultimately, I think outside powers cannot affect this.
And Paul, as a final question, I'm aware, obviously, of the follies of making predictions, but where do you see these protests going, and how long are they going to continue for, and what kind of change, if any, will they bring?
There have been many, many protests over the years. 2009, huge protests that seemed to be on the way to toppling the regime, and it didn't happen. This is a regime which has shown that it's prepared to do almost anything to remain in power. The protesters don't have the guns. They have perhaps the numbers on the streets. Katy, the lady that I spoke to, said something interesting. She said that going out on the streets, looking into the eyes, even of the special forces, the most loyal troops the regime can command, she was seeing doubt in their eyes, people even casting their eyes down to the ground. Again, that's an activist, maybe somebody who wants to believe that. But once you get the security forces flipping over, that's the moment for all of these authoritarian regimes where things start to move. We're hearing stories that they're drafting in Iraqi militias, Shia militias from Iraq, recruiting 15-year-old boys to their own paramilitary forces, a sign perhaps that they're worried about the loyalty of some of their troops. But you can never tell until the collapse comes. I wouldn't make any predictions except that this is not going to end quickly, and that if it is broken this time, it will be back again.
Well, Paul, we shall wait and see. Thank you very much for joining me today on Spectator TV. Now remember, you can subscribe to The Spectator this Christmas and get the next 12 weeks of print and online access, as well as a bottle of Polvershare champagne, all for just £12. This offer is available in the UK only. Go to www.spectator.co.uk/Santa to subscribe. Now then, the Harry and Meghan Netflix documentary is finally dropped, which is the latest attack from the Sussexes on the royal family they've left behind. In his cover article for this week's issue, our deputy editor Freddy takes a look at the warring Windsors, and he joins me now, together with the broadcaster and friend of the royal family, Gyles Brandreth, whose new book is Elizabeth, An Intimate Portrait. Gyles Brandreth, Freddy Gray, thank you very much for joining us on Spectator TV.
Great to be with you.
Thank you. Freddy, let's start with your piece. You've written the cover for this week's magazine, War of the Windsors, and of course the news angle here, of course, is today the Harry and Meghan documentary has dropped on Netflix, and I think you've seen a bit of it so far?
Yeah, I know the intelligent thing to say is that you shouldn't watch it because you shouldn't feed the monster and that you have no interest in it whatsoever, but I'm a disgusting human being, so I watched it quite promptly this morning. I also thought if I'm writing about it, I probably do have to watch it. And I will say that I think the other smart thing to say about it already is that it's very boring. And it is, but at the same time, it's unbelievably hilarious.
How so?
Because it's accidental comedy gold. I mean, it starts with Meghan sitting on a bed, I think, with a towel on her head, trying to make herself cry. Sorry, it's very cynical. Or upset, let's say. And then it goes into a sort of long bit about them falling in love, and there's ridiculous sort of piano music to sort of make you, to manipulate your emotions. But actually, I think that people watch this because they find it very, very funny. And in fact, it's almost a sort of new genre of comedy.
Very self-aware. You never guessed she was a Hollywood star before this.
No, well, actually, I was thinking about that. She's not a very good actress. That's the real problem. She can't even act herself.
When you say Hollywood star, I have American friends who are telling me that it's not as big a story over there as we may be playing it.
Yes.
That in fact, of course they're well known there, but they're not front page, they're not first division stars. They're sort of page 3 or page 5 as a rule. So we mustn't overdo it. Because I'm a biographer of the Queen, I rather like the Queen. I like to think I can take the long view. And I've been thinking about this and actually reflecting what we're seeing, the television thing, is about Harry and Meghan. It's not actually about the royal family. It's about a family, but it's not about the institution of monarchy at all. And I think he must be aware of that because, of course, his book is called Spare. It's in some ways a clever title, an heir and a spare, but he is the spare, and that may be part of why he's got problems. Meghan may be why he's got problems. Anyway, he's got sadness in his life and he's sharing it with us. But from the Queen's point of view, the great thing about being the Queen is she'd seen it all before. And, the 1930s, when she was a young girl, there was Edward VIII abdicating to marry his twice divorced American. Then the 1950s, there was all the scandal about Princess Margaret and wanting to marry an older man who also was a married man. So it's kind of roller coaster. And I think the Queen would have thought, this too will pass. And moved on and thought, well, what's on the other side? Because, during her illness, I was told by the master of the household at Windsor Castle, he said she's been watching Line of Duty. And my role now is as the explainer, which is really very funny because it's quite complicated. But she was trying to follow it.
No, I was going to say, David Tang, the late David Tang, once told me that someone asked the Queen when The Crown had just come out if she was watching that, and she said, "Well, I was there. That was her life." So she wasn't so much a fan of that. Freddie, one of the key sort of arguments and fault lines about the documentary has been about how William and Kate are portrayed in this, and just wondered if you think that perhaps is Kate Middleton perhaps the main target for the Sussexes in all of this?
That's what people are saying. I've only watched an hour of it. I think there's 3 hours out now. Certainly there's a sort of attempt to say that there's all this sort of self-pitying stuff about the gilded cage. They're all living in this gilded cage, and it's actually very difficult to be a royal, and all that stuff, which is a little bit sickening, I think, after a certain point. Some people are born into grinding poverty, and I think that they've obviously, they're trying to suggest that Kate, they sort of say, women marrying into this institution. Harry says, I'm worried about women marrying into this institution. This was actually in the trailer. And then there's a sort of shot of Kate looking unhappy. So they're obviously trying to suggest that. But it didn't feel like it's going to go after her in quite the way that some people seem to be concerned about.
Gyles.
Well, can I make a sort of almost a serious point, really, in that is this introspection a good thing? I first got into writing about the Queen through knowing the Duke of Edinburgh because I was the chairman of one of his pet charities. And he was very keen on, don't talk about yourself. People aren't interested. They really aren't interested. And I know he told each of his children, I don't know if he said it to his grandchildren, but as a rule, don't talk about yourself. Not because it's a risk, and it is a risk. If you answer one question to a journalist, they'll always ask another. It never ends. But more, actually, in life, don't think about yourself. Ask the other person what they're doing. People aren't interested in you. You should be interested in them. And his philosophy was look up, look out, don't think about yourself, don't talk about yourself, get on with the job.
I think it's fair to say that's a lesson that Harry and Meghan have not learned.
Well, the point is, I think they will be the unhappier because of it. Because the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh lived very long lives. He lived to 99, she lived to 96. And the Queen was a happy person, driven by duty, we know, sustained by faith, but made happy by her passions for her dogs and her horses. That's what kept her going. She had interests outside of herself. Same with the Duke of Edinburgh. He had so many interests. Same, actually, with the King, who is a workaholic, has a variety of real passions. I'm afraid television is not one of them. But that's what makes people happy, doing other things that are outside of yourself. And I think the problem for them will be, looking at yourself in the long run, I don't think is a good thing. Duke of Edinburgh really surprised me by being so interested in Jung. he surprised me a lot. I mean, for example, on his bedside, he had the poetry of T.S. Eliot as bedside reading. This is the Duke of Edinburgh. But he also really knew about Jung. And he said to me, Jung, towards the end of his life, did some research on former patients. And he looked at the ones who were happiest and the ones who were unhappiest. And the happiest ones were people who had interests beyond themselves, in science, in nature, in the world around them. The most unhappy were the people who were introspective, who were brooding about themselves. And that, in a sense, inspired his projects like the Duke of Edinburgh's Award Scheme, the Outward Bound Trust, all of that. And so his line was, there is science behind this. I'm not just saying it, but actually it's true.
That's extremely interesting because Meghan's podcast is called Archetypes, and it's a sort of total sort of lobotomized understanding of Jung. Not that I really understand Jung, but that it's actually every episode is supposed to be about an archetype, but it ends up being Meghan talking about herself again.
Indeed, funny enough, in my book, Elizabeth, this intimate portrait of the Queen, I actually touch on that because I was writing about him and archetypes, and one of the Duke of Edinburgh's friends was telling me how they got excited. There was a big book about archetypes written in the 1970s or 80s, and they were referring to it, and I suddenly thought, oh, actually, this podcast is called Archetypes, so there obviously is a connection, but it seemed to be a loose connection, because something had gone wrong somewhere along the line.
I'm not sure I think she's bright, actually, but I'm not sure she knows what it means.
What is interesting, too, is I do know for a fact that the Queen was very encouraging to Meghan at the beginning, and said to her, which did surprise me, in terms, you're an actress. If you want to go on working as an actress, you must. That is your profession. That is your skill. Do that. But Meghan said, no, I want to work for the Commonwealth. So the Queen was very excited. I want to be part of this and make it work. And the Queen then said, well, maybe as a kind of mentor, Sophie Wessex could help you. And that's when Meghan said, no, I don't think so. Thank you very much. I've got Harry. And I think that's where it began to go, thinking, maybe it isn't going to work out.
That's what I wanted to ask. Obviously, with the Queen, with her long view, has seen many outsiders coming into that family. How was she in terms of sort of welcoming them in, and how did she see that sort of role of, sort of her children and grandchildren marrying other people and coming into the firm?
She was very good about that. She was very blessed herself in that she has made a good marriage when she was young, and knew who she wanted to marry. People think, it's quite amusing, people think that the Queen first met the Duke of Edinburgh in 1939. All the obituaries state that, all the biographies say it was their first encounter. As the Duke of Edinburgh said to me, we were cousins, both great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. We had met before. And the idea that when the Queen was 13 and he was 18, it was a love at first sight, is completely preposterous in his view. But that's the myth. And that's what they want to say, that's what they will say. His line was that they didn't really become close until towards the end of the war. I think the Queen, who certainly took a shine to several other young men, indeed, as I show in my book, quoting letters from her, there was a cousin of hers, rather too close a cousin, who she really admired and thought was a very good marrying prospect. He became a clergyman, and I think they would have got on extremely well. But anyway, there was the Duke of Edinburgh. He was like a god. He was an Adonis, and it worked. But he was royal. So he knew the way it worked. He was a great-great-grandchild of Queen Victoria. So though he was, as it were, from an outside family from Greece, he nonetheless knew the way the system worked. Indeed, he was rather irritated when he was being shown around Windsor Castle, went to stay there before he married the Queen. One of the sort of equerries was showing him his room. He said, I do know my way around here. My mother was born at Windsor Castle. So he was, in a sense, an outsider who was also an insider. But when it came to, for example, her sister marrying Tony Armstrong-Jones, who became Tony Snowdon, and her children marrying outside of royalty, I think she was aware of the problems and was very welcoming. And I know that with Meghan, she wanted to take her, and indeed she did take her, on solo engagements. So you can see how it's done. Come with me. And the first trip they took them on was to my old constituency, the city of Chester. So I thought, this is a very good idea. But it turned out the reason that the Queen chose that, she saw on the programme that she was asked to open a theatre in Chester. So the Queen thought, actress in the family, come with me. And I have to say, everybody who was there, including the Lord Lieutenant who observed it the day, said Meghan was superb. She really delivered the goods. She stood, as it were, one step behind the Queen. The Queen led the way. She'd never been to the north of England before. She said, it's the north of England. She coped with the windy weather, but she was impeccable. and charming, and everybody loved her. And so that was a big success.
And there wasn't any kind of sort of residual snobbery about an actress entering the family at all, or anything like that?
None at all. They love showfolk. The Queen, I think, if given another life, the Duke of Edinburgh told me if he'd had his way, he wouldn't have gone to the Navy at all. He could be perverse. I mean, whatever you said, his reply was, yes, but. Whatever it was, yes, but. He always had a contrary view. So you talked about his service in the Royal Navy, he was mentioned as, yes, but. If I'd been given my own hand, I'd have joined the RAF. That's what he said. The Queen, I genuinely think, might have become an actress. Seems an extraordinary thing to say, because she was quite shy as a person. But I think often shy people get freedom when performing. And you remember how brilliant she was only earlier this year in that Paddington Bear sketch. Fantastic. But the Queen, I talked to the Queen about the Second World War. And I said, for you, what's memorable? And I think I prompted her by saying Winston Churchill. And she said, of course, Winston Churchill. And then she said to me, you can research this. I don't know whether it's true. She said, but I think that Winston Churchill is the only person who wasn't a member of the royal family ever to stand in the centre of the balcony at Buckingham Palace. I don't think anybody else in history has ever done so, which is intriguing. We can find that out. Anyway, she then went on to say, for me, I suppose the happiest times were the Christmas pantomimes. I said, oh, really? And for 4 or 5 years, they put on a Christmas show every year at Windsor Castle. She was in the lead with Princess Margaret. It was produced by a headmaster from a local school that not everybody liked. And I said, what part did you play? The principal boy, said the Queen. Doing this, principal boy. And she clearly adored doing it. And she said, when they did Cinderella, I said, who played Buttons? She said, we didn't call him Buttons, we called him something else. And she told me the name of the fellow. And she said, I'm still feeling worried about this. My sister and I, we sent him a telegram on the opening night from 2 secret admirers. That's all we signed it. And we've wondered ever since whether he realised it was us or whether he's wondering who those 2 secret admirers were. So the Queen was very in sympathy with actors and actresses. Not necessarily playing themselves, playing members of the royal family, but, as a rule.
And Freddy, on that trip to America last week, you see them in the Boston Garden, Kate and Wills. How do you think this has all gone down with America? Because obviously you got the Sussexes over in America right now with their claims, and Kate and William over here. How do you think the perception of the royal family in America have changed? As someone who's a long-time observer of the scene there.
Well, one insider said to me that they had a Kennedy off. And that William and Kate won, because William and Kate, the Kennedys are sort of American royalty, in a disgusting way, and William and Kate met sort of senior Kennedys, the elder Kennedys, whereas Harry and Meghan got this award from RFK's 7th child, and it was a sort of made-up woke gong called Ripple of Hope. I think Americans are interesting when it comes to the monarchy because they have a totally different perspective on it. And actually, I think Brits tend to think that Americans take monarchy much more seriously than they do. We think that they're obsessed with it and they're interested in it, and they are interested in it, but they also think it's a great joke. And that's where it comes to Harry and Meghan. I think they are sort of slightly all sniggering about it because they're sort of seeing how far they'll go down the path towards the Kardashians. An
accidental comedy, as you were saying earlier, this inadvertent comedy, the hilarity of it all.
2 things to say in relation to inadvertent comedy. And Coney Island once, I had an ice cream, this is 40 years ago, that I promise you was called Ripple of Hope.
Oh, really?
It was an ice cream, Coney Island. The other thing that happened, not 40 years ago, 50 years ago, I travelled in a lift with Robert Kennedy.
Oh, really?
By mistake. I didn't see the sign above the lift saying senators only. It was the Senate.
Were you? Right.
I was a student on the tour, you do the tour. And the lift doors opened, I stepped in, there was only one other person in the lift. It was Robert Kennedy. So I thought, this is rather exciting. Mr. Kennedy, how exciting do you mean? The doors were closing as he was pointing to the sign that said senators only. But I had a brief encounter.
Did you get out in time?
Yes, well, it was quite exciting. And also, am I allowed to share this with you? My trip with Robert Kennedy was more forthcoming than when I went on another lift trip with Michael Jackson.
Oh, wow.
Now we're name dropping. I got into a lift with Michael Jackson.
Talking about Kings of Pop.
With Michael Jackson and his minders. And it was a service lift. He was in London at the RIBA. He was going to a book launch. His friend Uri Geller, the fellow who bends the spoons, was giving a book launch, and Michael Jackson was going. We were in the service lift together, okay? So there I am, so excited, and probably telling Michael Jackson I once travelled in a lift with Robert Kennedy. Anyway, he doesn't respond. He's there all masked up. Before COVID, he was really ahead of the curve. He was all masked up, wearing a full Michael Jackson kit. He was not very big, with his burly mind. Anyway, he didn't say a word. Got out of the lift, walked away. And I said to his minders, well, that wasn't very friendly. There I was trying to be, gracious and admiring Mr. Jackson. He didn't say a word. And the minder said to me, it's a Monday. Mr. Jackson never speaks on a Monday. It's a good rule in life. My wife says, well, if only you could adopt that rule. Forgive me. Back to your subject in hand.
Not at all. Well, we're just coming to our end, unfortunately. Just to feel like we're just
it's a brilliant magazine,
we should do another whole section on lifts.
But actually, what about
the ups and downs?
I think it's great.
The ups and downs.
Look,
I can't believe Tarky's still alive. When eventually, in another 20 years, he drops off the perch, maybe I get a column at the back called Lifts, Ups and Downs. Ups and Downs.
Social climbing, perhaps, cool, comes very easy.
People I met on the way up, I'll meet them again on the way down, which is why it's such fun to see you do, boys.
We're probably running over time now, but I've got a good lift story related to the Senate.
Oh, good, Freddy.
So my old boss was she was a Hill reporter, and she was, Joe Biden, who was then a senator for Delaware, walked past, and there was a scrum of people. He was involved in some story, don't know what it was. And there was a scrum of reporters, and she was the only woman, and she was sort of being bustled about. And Biden got all gallant and said, "Hey, leave the lady alone. Come with me, darling. And brought her into the lift, the Senate lift, and then the door shut, and she thought, great, this is my chance to ask him lots of questions. And he got out a Snickers bar, and apparently inserted the whole Snickers bar into his mouth.
No.
And then just masticated
please.
throughout the ascent. And that's my live story. So we could do an ups and downs, but should we do it together?
What is this called? Spectator YouTube?
Spectator TV.
If this is what it's like, I'm going to be tuning in. Are you on every week?
No.
I think we should be on as a double act.
Yeah, no, I like that.
Honestly, a whole Snickers bar. He's got a big mouth, that Biden.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, the things you learn.
Coming on Spectator TV.
Spectator TV. Stay tuned. It's a great channel. I recommend it. I mean, who needs GB News? Now we've got Spectator TV.
Gyles, Freddy, thank you very much for joining me. And finally, this is the first Christmas since 2019 when COVID hasn't been foremost on people's minds. So will office Christmas parties come back with a fury? Cara Kennedy is certainly hoping so. She's written for the December issue of Spectator World about why she loves these occasions quite so much. She joins me now. Cara, thanks for joining Spectator TV. You've written for Spectator World about the Christmas party season. You've written that you hate Christmas, but you love the office Christmas party. Why is that?
It makes me sound really sad, doesn't it? Well, I've never been a fan of Christmas. I hate the idea of that you have to enjoy it. And I was actually speaking to Julie Birchall the other day, and she was like, I completely agree. I want to have fun all year round. And then when it comes to Christmas, you feel like you have to, which automatically makes it less fun. So I was wondering about what I could write about that's Christmassy, because it was for our December mag. And then I just, it was the time that we were arranging our Christmas party. It was meant to be in New York, but now it's been moved to DC. And I just kind of thought about how wild Christmas parties are and how they're always different to, or they at least feel different for me, to any other kind of work event.
Why do you think that is exactly? Is it just the time of year, or is it the kind of emotions that Christmas evokes, or is it a kind of license basically to let your hair down and break down some of the barriers in the workplace?
I think it's a combination. I think the timing is perfect because it's the time of year where everybody has 2 or 3 weeks off, so you can kind of take yourself away from it a little bit and think about your terrible behaviour that you've done at the Christmas party. And yeah, you just kind of have that breakaway. Obviously, in this industry especially, it's very stressful, tensions kind of build up, and then everybody's put in one room at the Christmas party and it's like chaos.
I've got to ask, I mean, you've started writing for Spectator World, but you've been to a variety of office Christmas parties. Which was your favourite one you've been to?
My favourite Christmas party, probably the Telegraph last year, because it's not so much what happened there, but it's the rumours afterwards. So there were rumours that I was like, can I swear on this?
Yeah.
Slut dropping on senior editors, which didn't happen, but I found that rumour absolutely hilarious. So I was quite happy that went round. And that's another great thing about Christmas parties, especially in journalism. We're all like terrible gossips. We love like the most salacious stories. So something can happen and then it kind of snowballs into a bigger story because we all love to tell stories.
Salacious gossip, I wouldn't know what you're talking about, but no comment.
You're the worst for it, James.
I'm the host, thankfully. You spoke to some of your friends and columnists about their best Christmas parties. Are there any we can repeat on air without getting ourselves into trouble, without ruining friendships, or perhaps anonymously?
I spoke to Julie, obviously in the piece, but when I spoke to her after it went to print, she told me about a lot more Christmas parties that she went to. And there was one, I think it was her first Christmas party, she was like 18, maybe 17, which I probably shouldn't say. But it was for the first publication that she worked for. And she walked in the room and everybody was given amphetamines, which is like my favourite story. And I think it shows that kind of old school journalists and younger journalists have just had totally different experiences of Christmas parties, because you hear like the great old Fleet Street days and they're a long change from what you see now.
That was one of the questions I wanted to ask you, which was this generational difference. Do you think there's perhaps been a change in recent years, perhaps even post-COVID, in how we approach the office Christmas party, and what once might have been a very modest or even more boozy affair perhaps in the sort of 90s or noughties is changed at all? Do you think that's something that is going to be a frequent issue, particularly when you look around different workplace office norms in other times, that the office Christmas party could be affected by the march of time?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's even more sad for like people in their early 20s, because a lot of them have only kind of just started working in offices again. A lot of my friends' first jobs were from home and they didn't really have that office experience. So to not even get together for like Christmas is really sad. And in the piece I talk about how like one of the tragedies of COVID was that everything was moved online. And I mean, you've done Zoom quizzes, they're hardly exciting situations, are they? So I think it is sad, and I think you'll see more and more young people missing out on situations like this. I mean, I spoke to a friend the other day whose Christmas party is going to be dry, so it can be inclusive of everybody, and it's just like totally ridiculous.
I mean, that's that. I mean, I think the presence of alcohol is very much a staple part. I think it's almost as, what is Christmas without alcohol? But do you think that presence of that does change the office dynamics? Because of course, hierarchy is such a presence in the workplace. Do you think that an office Christmas party can never really get rid of that sense of hierarchy in terms of managers and underlings, etc.? You must have seen a fair amount of the breaking downs of barriers at the Christmas parties you've been to.
Yeah, and I think that's another kind of generational thing. So young people at Christmas parties, especially like office-based Christmas parties, go in and they're really shy and they don't really know what to do. And it's always the older staff that straight away on the wine, boozed up, kind of dancing on the tables. And I think that's the best part, because when your senior manager is absolutely in a hole in the corner, it kind of allows you to loosen up more. But I think it's definitely generational. And I think that's because the older generation had such great Christmas parties, and young people just don't really know what they're doing.
Yes, I mean, I went to my first Christmas party when I was 17, and I remember escaping the amorous embraces of two postmenopausal older colleagues working at one of Britain's leading high street retailers. So that was quite an experience for a pubescent James to do. But obviously, you talk about generational differences, but also there's transatlantic ones, and you're now there in DC for your first Christmas party. Is there a difference in how the Americans approach these social gatherings to how we Brits do?
Oh my God, there's such a massive difference. In the piece, I speak to Julie Birchall and Christopher Bedford, and I couldn't have chosen two better foils for each other, because Julie is like, let's get a creative Stella and get shit-faced. And Christopher Bedford is like, we're going to have a martini bar, a champagne bar, and really kind of has a step-by-step guide of how his Christmas parties go. But he's interesting because he's lived in a house that has had very famous Christmas parties for like decades and decades. So he's kind of got it to a T. But even last night, I mean, I went for dinner with my editor, Zach, and Ben Domenech, and they were talking about how some Christmas parties they go to and they don't like it because it's just beer and wine on offer. And I was like, what more do you want? And they're expecting to go places with like martini bars and like different stations. And yeah, it just shows that Americans definitely have higher standards when it comes to Christmas parties than us Brits do.
That was going to be my final question, really, when it comes to standards. What are you most looking forward to about your first American and Spectator World Christmas party coming up later this month?
Oh my God, I have the best answer for this, because I didn't realise, but in DC, there's some bars left that you could smoke in. So that is my favourite thing. And I'm going to direct the party after our meal to one of the smoking bars and just sit there with a bottle of wine, not being able to see my colleagues through the smoky haze, and have so much fun.
Well, good luck to all your Spectator World colleagues at surviving that nicotine-fueled haze. Cara, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV.
Thank you. Always a pleasure, James.
That's it for this week. Once again, don't forget to subscribe to the Spectator's YouTube channel. Just click the subscribe button at the bottom of this video and tap the bell icon so you never miss another episode. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to The Spectator this Christmas and get the next 12 weeks of print and online access, as well as a bottle of Paul Roger champagne, all for just £12. This offer is available in the UK only. Go to www.spectator.co.uk/Santa to subscribe. That's everything for this week. Thanks again for watching, and do join us again next week.